And then, of course, before we start any presentation at Royal Roads, we always like to acknowledge that we live, learn, and work on the traditional lands of the Cossepsum and the Lekwungen ancestors and families who've been here for thousands of years. I'm working from home as well, and I'm working from the lands of the Cossepsum and Lekwungen peoples as well, and just so grateful to be able to do this work here today, to be able to provide this session for you here. So my name is Christy Jones. I'm an education advisor at the university, but I am so happy to pass it off for the rest of the session, as I'll be hanging out in the background, but Dr. Robin Cox will be moderating today. She's the program head for the MA in Climate Action Leadership. And then we're also joined by Adam Lerner, who's the founder and catalyst for Solvable, and Dr. Matthew Godsoe, who's the director of Resilience and Economics Integration Division at Public Safety Canada.
Hi, everyone.
With that, I will pass it over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Christy, and welcome everybody. So glad to have you all joining us, and we look forward to this session. So next slide, Christy, please. So we'll do a little bit about, we've already had some welcome and introductions. We'll frame a bit of the context for this conversation. This really is a conversation where we framed this as a discussion that we hope you will also join in with time for Q&A, and also just a brief nod to the MA in Climate Action Leadership and some of the other leadership programs at Royal Roads in case anyone wants to follow up and explore options for carrying on this learning and conversations in that environment. Next slide. So really, we all are living through a very interesting time, recognizing the Chinese proverb about beware of how much you invite interesting times into your life. And I would say that we're really living at a time of polycrisis or even a mega crisis. Yes, we are living in the midst of the pandemic, and we are really still in the midst of that and will be for some time. And we don't really know the trajectory of that, where the vaccines are very much a hope and, as many people have talked about, a light at the end of the tunnel. I would say it's a light in the tunnel. We don't know how that's going to play out with various variants. But we're also living, and this has taken a bit of a backseat during at least the first part of the COVID-19 pandemic, in the midst of what most people would agree is the most urgent threat to our existence as humans and to many species on the planet, climate change. So we have climate change and all the attendant issues that it's having, effects it's having on escalating disasters and disaster risk. We already have disasters without climate change. We have very clearly and has been very much exposed as part of the pandemic, the underlying social, cultural, political, and economic issues that have fueled inequities, have fueled injustices, and are fueling the Black Lives Matter movement, the Indigenous rights movement. So we have a lot going on right now that we are dealing with. And so we're also in a time with the pandemic particularly, where we are looking at governments, municipal, provincial, federal, global, investing a great deal of money and thinking and other resources, and not just governments, into our recovery from COVID and this the economic recession that we're in as a result of COVID and the public health measures. Next slide. So, just, I mean, these are just some of the figures and statistics, we just had, at the beginning of the week, the Insurance Bureau of Canada released a report talking about the costs of severe weather. So 2.4 billion in insured damages in Canada in 2020. And Matt has done research on, even without COVID, the many costs that escalating costs we're facing in terms of disasters, natural hazard related disasters. So these are escalating costs, and they are escalating in the context of climate change. Climate adaptation, this was a report last year actually, adaptation is estimated to cost municipalities $5.3 billion annually. That is trying to adjust to climate change. That too, those costs too will escalate as the impacts of climate change become more severe and widespread. the public health, Lancet and Canadian Public Health have both called climate change as the greatest threat to health, even though right now we're facing the pandemic, which is also linked to climate change in terms of the loss of habitat and the encroachment of human settlements on habitat. We know that, oh, there's looks like a spelling error. I think it's just a font issue, but every dollar invested in climate change prevention yields anywhere from $9 to $38 worth of avoided costs. So we know that there is some benefit from investing wisely. And we know that as we go forward with climate change, with the pandemic and whatever else comes our way, and we know that there are going to be other challenges, obviously, that many people are suffering already. We are the final stat that 100 million people will die between now and 2030 as a result of climate and climate related issues. Global economic growth is going to suffer, and there's lots of questions around whether we should even be anticipating or wanting economic growth at a time when we know that growth and consumption are an underlying factor of climate change. Next slide. So just a couple of quotes. Climate change is the greatest health threat of the 21st century, and it is recognized that the effects of climate change are being felt today, and future projections represent an unacceptably high and potentially catastrophic risk to human health. And this was written prior to COVID. And also with this from the Lancet Countdown, with the loss of life from the pandemic and from climate change measured in the hundreds of thousands, the potential economic costs will be measured in the trillions. Hard to imagine even what that is. And the broader consequences, so it's not just economic costs, of both of these crises so they're really calling for this link between COVID-19 pandemic and the recovery process and climate change, which is really at the heart of this webinar. So how do we start bringing these crises together, start thinking about how we address not only COVID-19 and the outfall, economic and otherwise of that, in ways that also support and further our agenda in meeting Paris Agreement targets and building our resilience in the face of what is here and what will be to come. Next slide. So that sort of brings us up to our first discussion with Matt and Adam and myself, which is this question around disasters as focusing events. There's this idea that when a disaster happens, whether it's a pandemic like COVID-19 or whether it's the hailstorms that happened in Alberta last year or flooding in Alberta, that they focus attention and they focus resources in a way that is very different from our everyday times. And so as focusing events, they also illuminate, as we have seen with COVID, these underlying issues and vulnerabilities that are systemic. They're not specific to the pandemic, for example. They're illuminated by that, and they have specific ways of playing out with the pandemic, but they are not unique to this particular disaster. So given the anticipated and in some ways unprecedented investments that are going to happen in the COVID recovery, how and why should we link addressing climate change and COVID recovery? And so I'm going to open that up to begin with you, Matt, and then Adam, just to chat a little bit about what your thoughts are in response to that question.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Robin. I just want to confirm, can you guys hear me now? I did a little bit of IT roulette where I went through 2 laptops and a phone, and I'm finally on something that works. So it was bound to happen eventually. I think from my perspective, there's a real, generally when there are large scale disasters, there's a real tendency to not want to politicize them and also to not want to draw conclusions that extend beyond the initial scope of the events themselves. And I think that this is a recurrent mistake that we suffer from in particular on the natural hazard side of things, where we do generally want to allow natural hazards to exist in a space that's different than human-induced threats. And also we want to keep the conversation fairly tightly focused on the specifics of our response and the specifics of kind of the very tactical lessons that we can learn. What we're seeing through COVID is a catastrophic disaster, the scale of which we probably have not seen, at least since the financial crisis, if not further back. And so it's telling us all kinds of things about how to deal with really massive catastrophic events. And the extent to which we learn how to build off of these lessons is really up to us. And I think the most proximate place that we can deliver these lessons is into the climate domain, where we're going to see other catastrophes coming in the coming decades that are going to be on an equivalent or larger scale than this. So this in some ways is a trial run, which is very severe, but not as severe as some of the other conceivable issues that we're going to have coming towards us in the next 100 years, probably in the next 30 to 40 years as well. So it's a real opportunity for us to take in those lessons. We have some time before the most acute impacts from climate change at the scale comparable to COVID are really going to be fully felt, their full breadth, their full brunt. So this is an opportunity for us to learn those more generalizable lessons, what we call in emergency management, the all hazards capabilities that would apply to future pandemics, but also help us deal with future climate driven events that are on a comparable scale. So that is, I think, what I would like to advocate for, is that we try to take these lessons and figure out not just acutely what they tell us about this pandemic and future pandemics, but really what they tell us about global disruptions and how we may be able to use this and springboard off of the lessons from this pandemic to deal with those future mass scale events.
Thanks, Matt. Adam, what are your thoughts? And then we can engage in discussion amongst us.
Thanks, and lovely to be here with everybody. I'm calling in from Vancouver, looking out, beautiful sunny day, North Shore Mountains. Very grateful for this place that we call Earth. So I think that I would, building off of what Matt was suggesting, think about time a little bit differently. I see the catastrophe that we have as, we could call it a disruption, but it is a continuum. And I want to just mention, if we think back to the time right before COVID, in the fall of 2019, we had one of the most unprecedented, since I think the original Earth Day, global marches around the world for climate. So there was already, and we had many different calls from the Sunshine Movement, from Extinction Rebellion. We had a lot of conversation that was actually happening and momentum that was building around climate action, including, that it was, of course, coming off of 2015 at the Paris Agreement. And I think that it's important, as challenging as COVID-19 has been to so many pieces of our lives, whether it's our kind of pro-social behavior and the ability to not be able to be in spaces with people and have a sense of community. The COVID-19 is existing within a system and behaviors and desires and a story, what kind of Thomas Berry or a Joanna Macy would call a story that pre-existed COVID-19, and we're still living within that story. And I think that what I find great value in is remembering, being able to think beyond, I guess, this moment in time, and realize that, as Matt's suggesting, it casts into the limelight some of the fundamental structural issues that are challenging. It also gives us a chance to build new capacity for the kinds of things that we actually want as part of the world that we want to live in.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting to me. So I have spent, the last 10 plus years teaching disaster emergency management, and now with this focus, growing focus on climate and the new program. And Matt, you know this, and we've chatted about this challenge between, yes, we talk about lessons learned from disasters, and we actually, as you know, sort of gave up that phrase and talked about lessons learned and applied, because we seem to learn lessons and then completely forget them, so we don't actually learn them or apply them. And this very sort of short-term thinking that we have, that you've also mentioned by talking about this time, like we have to remember that this is situated in a history of stories that just in some ways keep repeating and evolving, but not substantively changing the underlying systemic problems that keep fueling these particular kinds of challenges. So how do we shift that? Like, how do we, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, we know that there's a huge push, it's on the radio, everyone's talking, it's like getting back to normal or establishing normalcy or whatever. So there's this urge, understandable, to return to, or at least regain some kind of sense of normalcy. At the same time, as you have both pointed out, there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this about not only COVID, but about large scale disruptions that we know are already happening, have happened previously, and will continue to happen and will likely escalate. So what supports, from your perspective, what might support us changing that lessons learned and then discarded mentality, or that short-term thing? Well, we'll focus on COVID and then we'll think about climate change.
I feel like just on the subject of time, I mean, there's a great asymmetry between the amount of time that we have to implement policy prescriptions and different solutions to these challenges, and the time horizons on which we're going to see all of the impacts of them happening. So in particular on the COVID front, in particular on the climate front, where we have, in all probability, once the vaccines are out the door and we have a society that's ready to start interacting again socially, there's still probably going to be a hangover of maybe 3 or 4 months when some of these transformative policy and programmatic ideas can reasonably be implemented. And after that, that window closes. So I think one of the challenges that we have in terms of lessons learned from acute events, from disasters, is that within that 3 to 4 month window, we lose the opportunity, we lose the initiative. And when we go through lessons learned and after action reporting, it takes us that long just to garner the lessons, let alone figure out what we're going to do about them. And by the time we have those answers, the political will or the opportunity for us to implement those things is largely gone. Mm-hmm. So one of the things from a climate adaptation perspective that I think is really important is to have our shelves stocked with some of the ideas that are going to be most beneficial and most impactful. And as these focusing events occur, that we're able to pull those ideas off the shelf and recognize the applicability and the generalizability of those things. And some of those are distinctly to do with traditional adaptation measures. I think some of those are also to do with whom in society bears the disproportionately negative impacts of these mass disruptions. And these are knowable things. These are things that we don't need to wait for the next event to know that certain segments of the population are going to bear the disproportionate negative impacts. So let's be ready with some solutions with some of those answers. One of the things that was amazing about COVID was the emergency response benefits that came out from the federal government in Canada, but also from countries around the world. After we had had a number of years of conversation about something like universal basic income, we basically implemented it. And so the question for us is, are we seeing sufficient benefit from this that's going to be generalizable and apply elsewhere, that we should really take another look at it? Because it's obviously something that as a society we can accomplish, maybe not perfectly, but we can do. So now that the question of implementation is gone, is that moral imperative, is the question of like, should we be doing this moving forward, something that we can address, recognizing that the benefits from this kind of fairly transformative intervention help with COVID, but also help with a number of other different mass disruptions that we can see coming at us into the future.
Well, and goes some way to, I would say probably some small way to addressing the enormous inequities, economic and otherwise, that people face. Adam, you work a lot with corporations and you work around values and supporting change. What are your thoughts about how we take advantage of this moment in our history, in the story, to really fundamentally make some of the changes that need to be made in order to be both recovering from COVID, but also ready for these other things, and be addressing this, existential threat of climate change?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is I just want to, before I go into the corporate side, I just want to acknowledge and I'm really glad, Matt, you brought up the universal basic income. And I think one of the things that has really happened that we've seen is that there's been a degree of experimentation in kind of social models, and whether there's models in the ways that we're thinking about our climate action, or the ways that we engage with kind of basic universal access to income and wealth distribution, is that we've seen kind of in this time, we've seen a scale of experimentation around the world. And I think very importantly, an attention to that experimentation from other countries looking beyond. If we even look at the selfish interests as it came to countries trying to figure out what their emergency response was going to be, there was both an inner looking, but also looking outward towards the rest of the world and looking at what was happening in other places and looking at the data that was coming in response to those actions. And I think that kind of framework that we're seeing in terms government action and our ability to look beyond the boundaries of our own nation and start looking at the data and experiment very, very healthy, not just beyond, well beyond what our situation with COVID, but going into, as we approach the national, and it will be even regional and level in climate action, which we need huge amounts of experimentation, but we need that lens of analysis. We need the research that's there. We need to be evaluating it. So thank you, Matt, for bringing that in. In terms of the corporate piece, I think, to go back to the time horizon, we, over the past 18 months, from the corporate sector, we have seen a massive wave, what I would call, of commitments around climate action that just, quite frankly, didn't exist before about 18 months ago. Before, it was kind of piecemeal, where some corporations were recognizing that they had sustainability goals, but the magnitude of the goals that they have put in place and the significance on transforming their business is massive compared to, especially over the last 12 months. And while many of those goals have long horizons, just like the Canada Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act is looking out to 2050. It's the same within the corporate space, that they're putting out goals typically that have a time horizon of 10, 20, 30 years. And we need that same degree of accountability, and hopefully through whether it's the institutional investor and shareholder aspect of public corporations can create that kind of accountability for them. But I think that we are seeing very, very positive signs from some companies that we would be very shocked, would have been very shocked just a couple of years ago, into realizing that climate action is a necessary part of them having a thriving business. Because, I mean, in the most basic terms, you hear, Lucas Joppa from Microsoft and others talking about how they recognize this kind of precondition that if the world in their customer base is unhealthy and is in a situation, a disaster situation, that has direct ramifications for their business. So if they are operating in an uncertain environment with lots of inequity, they also recognize selfishly at the same time it's going to have a huge impact on the health of their business. And I think that kind of recognition, where you're starting to see a more holistic picture between corporations, the kind of well-being factors, thinking about their stakeholders and the stakeholder responsibilities, is a really positive sign as it comes to kind of corporate accountability. But the next piece is really going to be, and thankfully there's some researchers that are doing it, that are really diving into these commitments, and whether the companies, and especially institutional investors such as the BlackRock, how are they following through in their commitments? What does it look like when they go to vote? They have shareholder resolution votes at a certain company, and how are BlackRock and other institutional investors actually voting on those resolutions that are in favor of the climate action? So I think we're going to see a lot more organizations, certainly within academia, researchers, but also other not-for-profits. I have a very dear friend who's the CEO of a UK shareholder action organization called Share. They're called Share Action. Amazing organization. I think we're going to see a lot more of those emerging that creates these kind of accountability structures that's actually analyzing goals that are hard to, I mean, they're far out, right? And if we even think about Canada has now proposed that they're going to have this kind of 5-year frame of accountability, and that it's quote unquote legally binding, which is also quite interesting.
So I mean, it's interesting. So there's this accountability piece, not only for corporations, but for governments, and strengthening the accountability. And then on the other side, because I think there's a tension there, can we continue? So you mentioned, corporations' accountability and a bottom line interest, perhaps a moral interest as well, but a bottom line interest in addressing climate because they recognize that it's going to impact their business. But I think for Matt, you were talking about having some really a preventative or sort of a prevention orientation, which is you have things ready to initiate. And in both cases, some need for really out of the box creative thinking. I'm thinking, the MA in Climate Action Leadership was really, at Royal Roads, was really designed with that in mind, that sense that these kinds of changes need to happen right across all sectors, and they're going to require, in some fundamental ways, whether we're addressing climate or social justice, racism, some out-of-the-box thinking. I mean, I sort of go back to feminist authors, and you can't, the master's tools will not build a better house or a different house. They're going to recreate what is already there. And so this idea of, and in the MA in Climate Action Leadership, we've tried to do that by adding in an element, a core element of design thinking to try and encourage people thinking differently. But I'm intrigued to think how we support, whether it's governments, which are not necessarily known for creative innovation, or large corporations, even in businesses. There's a bottom line imperative. How we start building that kind of creative, out-of-the-box thinking without just being trite about it, but how we support that change in thinking in all sectors, so that we actually enact some of these differences, whether it's having ideas ready to launch, not waiting for disaster to create those ideas, or whether it's helping businesses and corporations move beyond only being accountable, which is important, but also starting to think about how they do things differently. And I'm just going to shift to the next slide, I think. Or not. Next slide. Oh, there we go. To sort of prompt some thinking around that. So, in both in disaster management, and we talk about climate, we have been talking a lot about creating climate resilience, and like all words, it's contested, and there's people who are fans of it and people who say it's not. But this idea of resilience and being able to anticipate and adapt to these disruptions when they happen is also being challenged. And I bring in Taleb just to a couple of quotes for this idea that, is resilience what we should be aiming for? Is it enough? Do we have to be more disruptive than that in our thinking? And so a couple of his quotes: some things benefit from shocks. They thrive and grow when exposed to volatility, randomness, disorder, and stressors, and love adventure, risk, and uncertainty. This notion that he frames as anti-fragility, which is beyond resilience or robustness. This idea that resilience kind of resists or is able to adapt to, but essentially try and stay the same, whereas the anti-fragile gets better. I think in there are lots of things that I would question about that, in terms of who is able to do that, who has the power and the privilege to sort of benefit from shocks. But nonetheless, that idea that perhaps what we need to be doing is something more than aiming towards resilience. And the final quote from Taleb: wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire. Likewise, with randomness, uncertainty, and chaos, you want to use them, not hide from them. You want to be the fire and wish for the wind. This idea that somehow we have to, next slide, meet these challenges in a different way, rather than trying to turn away from them in some ways or avoid them. That we need to face what is coming, and we need to face it in ways that involve potentially a different values, or at least a reflection on our values and our way of doing things. So that it sort of leads to the next question, which is, what do, whether it's a government, a municipality, an educational program like the MA that I was talking about, or any of the programs, what do any of us need to do to invest in this more resilient or more anti-fragile future? And the second sort of question that relates to that is, in order to rise to that challenge, what might we have to sacrifice, or should we be willing to sacrifice? Because there will be trade-offs. Matt?
I don't know if I have a particularly intelligent answer to the question, but maybe just some additional reflections on it, where I think right now we're talking a lot about what the solutions are coming from the government perspective or from the industry perspective at the level of corporations, and what kinds of accountabilities can be put in place to deal with that. And I think that that's a great and interesting question. On the government side, I think that there is also the supply, the demand side from the public about what they're willing to tolerate and the kinds of risks that they're willing to deal with. And likewise, on the corporate side, to the extent that corporations are still beholden to their shareholders for consistent growth quarter after quarter, there are two almost competing things that are happening, where you have your sustainability and accountability moving on one track, but you continuing to need to grow on the other. And so if we as the public owners of some of these corporations don't adjust those expectations as well, then they're going to continue to be two separate things that are moving in parallel and kind of working against each other, rather than being more integrative and working towards a more coherent, better version of what the future could look like. So as we were talking about experimentation, for example, in the context of the emergency response benefit, one of the reasons why that was able to roll out so quickly on such a large scale was that the public was willing to allow for some errors, right? And so the accountability was still there, but there were going to be mistakes, because we had to pick between getting something out quickly and getting something out that was perfect. And I think there's a fairly significant onus that falls back on the general public to demand of their large institutions, whether they're governments or private sector institutions, more of that kind of, let's do the quick thing now and recognize that there are going to be errors. Let's allow for a little bit more flex in the system, some more innovation, recognizing that it's not going to be perfect, rather than forcing everyone to wait till we have a perfect solution. And in the climate space, I think what we've seen over the last 30 years is we haven't reached perfection yet, so we aren't actually adapting at scale. So can we just get over the fact that we're never going to have all of the answers and all of the perfect solutions, but we can go down the road of making these smaller innovations that are get us closer or further from a desirable future end state. And let's start chomping away at those pieces one bit at a time.
Interesting though, isn't it, that, to allow for error, and I agree, whether people knew they were agreeing to allow for error was there, and there was some, sort of more positive response or recognition that was going to happen, but that is happening also at a time when error is not, if you think about social media backlash, and, that we live in a time where people jump on error pretty quickly and can get slammed and shamed for it. And how we sort of cultivate a willingness, the flexibility in a culture that, and I don't just mean the Canadian culture, but sort of dominant culture anyway, that is actually quite almost anti-error, that particularly from governments, but also from corporations. It's like, not that we should accept error, but that how do we support this kind of more recognition that to experiment absolutely relies on error.
And I think there's so there's a number of things I wanted to comment about this. I mean, one is that I completely agree with Matt about whether we're talking about the corporate interests and the relationship with shareholders, or we're talking about the government relationship with citizens, is that it's absolutely reliant on us, and this is why I brought up the concept of story very early on, is this concept of recognizing the story that we actually want to embrace as our kind of new story. And therefore, if we can actually be in the place of considering what is the story that we think is the kind of unfolding for the next 30 years, that is the thing that undergirds the kind of citizen action. I mean, I went up to my bookshelf to grab the book by Erica Chenoweth, which talks about that a movement requires 3.5% of a populace in order to tip. And I think that what obviously social action and even citizen engagement has been very, very challenged during COVID. But I think that this piece about what does involvement look like in our as a civic involvement as a citizen, what does it look like to be involved, even as the notion of a shareholder inside of companies that people are invested in, and particularly funds are invested in, is a really important question. I just wanted to share a quote from John Mayer and Michael Maniates that said, "The assumptions that citizens are willing to forego current prosperity for future gain rest on the rather implausible belief that most of us are wholly content with our lives and the society within which we live now. Only in this circumstance would we experience any change in our consumption or behavior. on behalf of the environment as a net and intolerable loss. And I think what the point is that if you ask a lot of people, we know, at well-being scores are very, very low. There's a general unhappiness, there's senses of alienation in our culture. And so if we start to recognize the story that we're telling ourselves is actually is an old story and move into this new space, it becomes that while there's a transition, it becomes this kind of galvanizing force internally towards the action that we need to see in this accountability. And things that we would conceive of as quote unquote sacrifice are actually not truly sacrifices, because we're actually willing to forego those things for something that we can now see as part of a future that we're trying to build towards.
There's just such a negative alignment of historical forces right now, where I think had climate really started getting worse in the 50s, and we were sitting in 1985 trying to have this conversation, because we would have so much more of a common frame of reference about what the stories are that we believe that we're sitting in, then I think that would be a different conversation. Trying to have that conversation about a common narrative when we're so socially fragmented as a result of social media and all of the information channels that currently exist for people. We almost have that 3.5% causing social movements in some ways working at cross purposes, where we have a number of movements that are moving that we probably, many of us would wish weren't, at the same time as we're trying to move forward with some of these more positive movements. And it's such a challenge at this time in history to try to use that approach to make things move forward for us in a way that gets us to like a net positive trajectory from a resilience or anti-fragility perspective in the face of climate.
But I do think that, yeah, and I appreciate that challenge. I mean, I do think that there's a couple big pieces of legislation that have been put in place over the past year that are going to have long-term ramifications. One is the whole Indigenous Land Guardians piece, which now we're starting to recognize in Canada that we have this this incredible wisdom that comes from so many centuries of stewardship in living in relationship with nature and being able to have a degree of well-being and satisfaction in that lifestyle, that we're now giving others agency who didn't have agency in order to be the protector of our lands and create a very different relationship. In parts of Canada, and I think half of these new protected lands are now under the guardianship of Indigenous guardians, and that's a huge development, I think, in our kind of national trajectory. The second piece is even the moving, even though I don't think it's as ambitious as it could have been, is that we went from a 17%, I think it was, for land protection and 13% of our oceans. Now we have over the past year, we have a new benchmark, and I think this even came in the fall, of a commitment to protect 25% of lands and 25% of oceans across Canada. And while some other countries have said 30%, that's a big, big long-term change. And of course, it goes back to our first question around accountability. But I think a couple of these pieces of legislation, and of course the net zero commitment to 2050, these things create that kind of enduring commitment and momentum that, I think to some degree will be able to hopefully overcome some of those challenges of political will, which I think you astutely recognize, Matt, and know much better than I do from being inside of government.
Well, that political will and as you earlier referred to, Matt, the public will underlying that, this balance, and of course the short-term nature of our political cycles, which don't necessarily encourage longer term thinking and these investments that pay out over decades, and may not pay out in your term, which is again another challenge. And so sort of coming back to that thought and this idea that we ultimately we have made some gains. We have a fragmenting of stories in a way, and probably something that's a much needed fragmenting, where we've had this sort of grand narrative guiding us that is clearly not, I would argue clearly not guiding us in a good direction, or we wouldn't be in the state we're in terms of our climate, our narrative around our relationship to nature and our relationship to each other, our narrative around who is deserving of economic wealth and how one comes about that. So sort of coming back, it's not, if any one of us had, had the solution, if there is such a thing, obviously we'd be doing that and probably not participating in this webinar. But, again, sort of thinking like, what can help sort of shape that? We know that there are entities, forces. I'm thinking of Naomi Klein and shock doctrine and disaster capitalism. We know that there are entities who take advantage of these moments of disruption and shift and change and take them in a particular direction, a direction often that benefits, shareholders in large corporations, for example. So what can we do either as citizens or as educators or as, leaders? And I think, cultivating leadership, whether that's at the individual level or political leader. What do we need to do to help shift that direction and take I hate the word take advantage, but recognize this opportunity for change and actually use it as an opportunity for change, substantive change.
I'm going to advocate here, and this isn't just because it's a Royal Roads webinar, but I'm going to advocate here for the really important piece about post-secondary and even all the way down. I mean, I have a child who's in grade 7, so still in primary education. The educational piece is massive, because if we look at a lot of the conversations and where the story rests is
Right.
not, of course, it comes out of our homes and our social communities, but it also comes out of the education systems that we're brought up in. And I in Vancouver, we've had a movement to start incorporating climate education, even at the certainly at the secondary level. And I think the way that we're actually seeing institutions, Royal Roads being a perfect example, stepping into roles that are really challenging the way in which we approach problems, as you said, using different methodologies such as design thinking. But who's at the table to consider those problems together? How multidisciplinary they are, and what is the? And I think it creates a kind of different expectation around engagement and moral imperative that will be the driver for looking very different and, generationally, even though they're going to be fed into a system coming out that is in many ways counter or an immune response, they might even encounter an immune response to their new way of thinking, that eventually, as we see cascading results of these programs such as your own, and I wrote this weekend about the initiative to resuscitate the Bauhaus from Germany as part of the European New Deal. I think that this is going to have huge effects in terms of the individuals and how they react to policy and engage in policy, as well as how they engage in even their workplaces. I mean, we're now seeing law students, law societies that are protesting at a recruitment events against companies who they know have, say, for instance, been huge advocates and supporters of fossil fuel legislation and lobbying. So now we have, they go to Yale, they go to Princeton or Harvard, and these law students are actually protesting the law firms that at some of the most kind of established institutions. And I think we're seeing this in various capacities. And it's because the will of students, and therefore also us as citizens and also us as employees, is fundamentally starting to shift in terms of that expectation of who we're willing to work for and who we're willing to endorse.
Yes, and I mean, I obviously work in an educational space and am very invested in that. One of the comments was, education not only for young people and university, but education writ large is needed. And I think, again, coming back to this moment in time where so many of the conversations that I hear anyway, at the provincial level and at the federal level are about workforce skilling up. And a lot of those conversations are about very concrete skills, and we've talked about, and you hear governments talking about shovel-ready projects, which implies that it's a project probably that requires a shovel in order to be, funded. So how
Gotta wonder what they're shoveling.
Well, good question. So how do we, and there was another question about, how do we shift the conversation to action. Like, so education is one, and that's probably both a short and a long-term investment. And yet here we are in this moment, both where we have this, again, infusion of resources and investments that's going to continue on for the next year or two, whatever. And we have the absolute urgency of climate that we can't wait for. So how do we start infusing the kinds of shifts, whether it's a shift in values or beliefs or a shift in understanding how systems change work? What do we need to do in this space? What can we do in this space to address both the fact that the resources are going to be invested? So we probably haven't done what you described early on, Matt, about, you know, having this thinking long before the disaster occurs. So we have this moment and we have this impulse to reinvest in things that may or may not be getting us closer to that change.
Not too long ago, when the pandemic hit and it was clear that everybody was going to be locked down, one of the things that I did with my team is at public safety is we went through the Yale University Science of Wellbeing course. And as part of that course, one of the things that they taught was this GI Joe bias. So you're probably familiar with Kahneman and Tversky and thinking fast, thinking slow, and all the host of cognitive biases that we have playing against us as we try to make responsible long-term strategic decisions. And this GI Joe bias was a new one for me. So I thought it was worth mentioning here. I'm not sure if anybody else is a child of the 80s and remembers the GI Joe cartoons where like there would be a lesson and at the end GI Joe would come on and say, and now you know, and learn and knowing is half the fight. And Laura Santos, the professor from Yale's point is actually knowing is none of the fight. Yeah. And so just the sharing of information, and this is something we know from emergency management, just telling people that the risk exists actually on its own doesn't lead to a whole lot of behavioral change. So as we're looking at this education, regardless of what level we're talking about, and I've seen some of the comments come in speaking not just to elementary and secondary education, but post-secondary and lifelong learning, part of that conversation needs to be a shift about learning how to operate within the systems that we have, and kind of maybe flipping a question, which I feel like we hear and I've advocated for in the past, which is, you know, we need transformative change or we're never going to be able to catch up with things. I think that that's still true, but I do wonder to what extent that puts us in a posture of an adversarial posture against large institutions. Right. When instead we could ask ourselves, what if the thing that I thought was the biggest disadvantage was actually the greatest advantage? What if the fact that you have large scale institutions and you have to work through them actually is the benefit? It's the secret to unlocking the transformative change. So rather than trying to undo them, we have to figure out a way to operate within them, but still get to the kinds of desirable futures and desirable changes that we're after. And so part of the education then has to be, how do you become an effective agent of change within these systems, still pursuing the transformative ends, but applying a different means? And I feel like the climate adaptation conversation so far has been very much focused on the science and the scenarios. Again, that commission of the GI Joe bias. If we just tell people how bad it's going to be, they'll figure it out and they'll take action. And then when that doesn't work, we switch immediately to a wholesale transformative narrative, which is like, well, then we just got to blow the whole thing up, which I think is the desired end state in a lot of ways, but it kind of skips that so important implementation phase of how do we get to the end state. And that's a part of the promise, I think, of the program that we're talking about today at Royal Roads. And I hope that that infuses more of the education at all levels moving forward, because I feel like that's that necessary implementation step, which takes us from the diagnostic of the problem to the end state, but figures out a good way to move that forward, where I feel like we just haven't been able to pick up sufficient momentum on that implementation stage just yet.
I agree. I also hope that for the Climate Action Leadership Program and other educational programs at Royal Roads and elsewhere to sort of infuse these changes. And you certainly see more of this infusion of thinking around Indigenous rights and social justice and transformative approaches. Adam, you work in I know a little bit about your work, and you work in contexts where one could argue change might be also quite difficult. And I think you're coming at it from a values base. Can you talk a little bit about, because fundamentally this is the challenge that you've just articulated, Matt, which is how do we support maybe holding the transformative agenda and working towards it while we're also infusing systems that exist with people that also believe change is needed and understand how to make it, And, how do we do those things simultaneously rather than thinking that it's an either or? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm really, thank you for bringing it up, because I was going to type a response to Abigail Reardon typed in something that related to kind of what you asked, which was, I'm on board with lifelong learning and action, but the people I work with, the regular Canadian greater than 40 years old, is a hard sell. And I think that our learnings and working inside of kind of building, catalyzing action inside of the corporate environment, especially in large corporate environments, is for better or for worse. And I think, Matt, you're making some really valuable points about kind of scale, and some of that scale, instead of just trying to overthrow an entire system that has large scale institutions, whether those are government or corporate, we also need to think about how we actually leverage those for be able to move things much faster. Is that I think that it does, for better or for worse, have to involve the leadership team. So if inside of an organization you do not have leadership, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a CEO, but there has to be inside of the executive suite, or certainly at a board level, the kind of advocacy for both a worldview that recognizes the importance and significance of climate change and climate adaptation in the future of that corporation, and that the second piece is that it is moving from what is kind of what the typical kind of 20th century or later 20th century corporate model, which was very much got into this kind of top-down hierarchical leadership style, into a leadership style that was much more decentralized and much more motivating in terms of the capacity for individuals inside of the organization to actually be able to make change. And I think that you need both. So you need both the leadership that is a champion, that recognizes the significance of climate as for broadly for society as well as for their business. But you also need the kind of decentralized organization that enables individuals to actually rise to be able to have significant action and catalyze that action across not just their colleagues, but also across the organization. And having that mix of both, where you have this matrices that overlaps, that you have both the executive leadership and you have this kind of decentralized organization that is very much about empowering the individual self, is not as large as we would like it to be. But there are those companies, and you certainly see the movement even in kind of especially in the private space, with kind of the B Corp type companies that have gravitated to such a model. So those do exist, and I think that they're going to grow over time. But I think you need both as a precondition for success.
And I think we have a system, an economic system anyway, political and otherwise, but economic system globally that relies on continued growth, because growth creates greater consumption, which is about production, which, it's an endless cycle. So is there, and we don't have a ton of time for this question, but any thoughts, it sort of ties into this sacrifice question, like do we need to sacrifice something? Can we hold on to everything that we have and still meet this challenge? I would argue that we can't. We've shown that we can't. We've demonstrated that we can't. Here we are in the mess that we're in. So in the last, couple of minutes, do you want to each take maybe a minute or so to respond to this question of can and are we, and should we be willing to sacrifice, and what might that sacrifice be?
I mean, yeah, well, maybe all I would contribute to this is, I think that there's an alternate framing to that question, which is, what are we already sacrificing? Right. The counterfactual is the actual issue here, because we're already sacrificing things that, were we not in the midst of already letting them go, we would say that these are really important to us. It just so happens that we've gone through this process of like reverse hedonic adaptation, where we're boiling in the water, and so we don't recognize the predicament that we're actually in. So I think that I would just reframe that and say, how do we actually have an honest conversation about what we are sacrificing today and what we may sacrifice in the future, and then do the analysis in that way, because I think that that's a more real version of the decision that sits in front of us.
Thank you. Adam?
Yeah, I really love that and totally embrace that notion. And we had it in preparation for this call, thinking about the kind of Stoics, how they embraced this idea of really being able to look at reality. And that goes into Buddhism as well, being able to look at reality and the importance of suffering and recognize suffering is inherently a kind of part of the human condition, but also makes us better. And so I think that's a really that is a really critical piece. I think the question around it's a really big it's a really big question to tackle right now. The ability, the corporate sacrifice, if I take it from the corporate lens, is unfortunately, like, we can look back at a company in the leadership, somebody like Paul Pullman, who was at Unilever, who was able to really be one of the first companies to have significant sustainability targets and climate action. He had about 8 years of runway until the shareholders got fed up and said, we're not going to keep paying for this any longer. And I think that's I think hopefully that will change, but I think there's a checkered track record as we look back. But I would call upon, there's some great, I found great resonance in Donella Meadows and the kind of Club of Rome limits to growth work in the early 70s, which I think really holds now. And the example that I and many others hold up is a private company, which is Patagonia, and who has fought this notion of growth and in fact built into its values a kind of anti-growth mentality. And I think that despite they've grown hugely, but I think that looking, and I wrote a piece about this as well, looking specifically at the kind of corporate charters of the organization, and this is where B Corps are really significant, is thinking about what is the relationship to growth that's built into the overall charter of the organization. Especially if you're a private company, it's quite different. And I think that there's a values piece that was interwoven into Patagonia I think it was in the early 80s, as documented by Yvonne's book, Let My People Go Surfing, that set the precedent for everything that was to come in shock and non-shock environments. And I think that's certainly a liberty of a private company that public companies don't have.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of conversation happening in the chat room, and some of the things like, what would it look like if we fundamentally changed to a circular economy? And we certainly see elements of that happening in small ways. This idea that suffering may be a part of the human condition, but some people suffer and sacrifice more. And how do we shape leadership and whatever initiatives we're doing in ways that really address these fundamental inequities that are built into the system? This idea that Canada, there was a conversation about carbon footprint of Canada, and that we might, as a country, have a greater influence than perhaps we think we have. Anyway, this is a conversation that clearly could go on, and I've seen a couple of people saying, oh, it'd be great to have part 2 of this. Maybe we'll do that. I just want to flip quickly to the next slide, if you would, Christy, just to wrap this up. To finish with this quote and then a couple of other thoughts. When we dare to face the cruel social and ecological realities we have been accustomed to, courage is born and powers within us are liberated. Powers within us are liberated to reimagine and even perhaps one day rebuild a world, or reimagine, I would say, a world. Do not look away. Do not avert your gaze. Do not turn aside. This real invitation to jump into this space of the challenges that we face, as you have both done with this webinar, and really start unpacking this and having these kinds of conversations, I think is so critical. That leads me to the next slide, which is part of the reason that we've had this webinar, is to really have these conversations, but also to let others know about some of the work that's happening at Royal Roads. We're currently engaged in a climate action task force that's trying to build a climate action plan, a bold climate action plan for Royal Roads, which, as you both pointed out, will require the plan and the implementation and the commitment to resources and accountability. We also have this new graduate diploma and master's degree in climate action leadership, which is just launching in May, which is really an attempt to cultivate some of these leaders in and across society and governments and corporations that both of you have mentioned, with this different orientation to what it is we're doing, and a sense of empowerment about being able to affect change in systems and in lives and communities. We also have some other, next slide, some other programs in leadership. Key dates, but you know, School of Leadership has many programs, and leadership is often built into many of the other programs. But if you're interested in any of these programs at Royal Roads, please do reach out to our advisors to hear more about the start date. I mean, you can go back to the MA in Climate Action Leadership slide, which starts in May, and applications are happening. But you'll find all of that in the chat and also in the Royal Roads website if you're interested in that. And I'm saying that, I mean, obviously it's marketing Royal Roads, but I think ultimately education does have a role to play in this. And I invite anyone to explore what that looks like for them, whether it's a formal program or an informal program. The MA in Climate Action Leadership is an open pedagogy program. So once it's up and running, anyone will be able to access the course, look at the activities, look at the resources that we're using, and look at the resources that students produce and share out in the world in their blogs. So again, encourage anyone to follow that and to connect with enrollment if you're interested in that here or, you know, at any institution really, to explore how we collectively marshal our creativity and our amazing capacity as human beings, our real amazing capacity as human beings to, you know, reinvent, to reimagine, to recreate. We've got, you know, that is what we do. And to really start thinking about how we do that around these issues at this moment in time, at this very critical moment in time, both for the immediate crisis of COVID and the larger crisis of climate change and the fundamentally and historically very entrenched crises of racism and structural racism and economic inequities, et cetera. So thank you all for joining us in this quite brief webinar. Keep posted. Maybe we'll carry on the conversation in a second webinar. I know there's way more that you, Adam and Matt, could offer in this conversation. So thank you both very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a wonderful day. And yeah, that trite phrase, be the change. Let's all be that change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
everybody.
you.